Ah, the moon. As it rotates above this disc-shaped planet we all share, it magically casts darkness upon half the land. Really, I'd love to visit the moon at some point, but unfortunately, we're all stuck in Earth's gravity well. So without harnessing enough chemical energy to destroy a whole city block, well, we're gonna stay here.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
I can get a motion sick sometimes too, so I think I'm just gonna take the blue pill and play Moon at Home in Stationeers. But what is Stationeers, I hear you cry out in desperate confusion. Worry not, simple-minded viewer, for I have telepathically sensed your question. I was going to talk about this game either way. You read the title. Stationeers is a survival crafting game, kind of like if Minecraft was epic, but instead of exploding green genital monsters, the only enemies in Stationeers are the hostile environment of space mixed with human error. Cry out in triumphant victory when your little doohickey squirts out an ingot, or wail in agony as your doohickey catastrophically explodes. This is Stationeers. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to build a super sweet base in space. There are many planets and moons we could choose to die on, but the best place to start is probably Earth's little dipshit orbital cousin, the moon. Besides bitch-slapping the Earth back into a molten slush ball 4.5 billion years ago, the moon provides easy access to a metric shit-ton of solar energy for us to run our base on. And the complete vacuum means that the environment is much more predictable, stable, and safer than in other locations. Besides all that, Mommy says I'm a big boy, and big boys play the hardest difficulty. With a brutal start, our starting equipment is stripped down to the bare essentials. And on Stationeer difficulty, the plastic straw has been outlawed in accordance with our alliance to a newly sentient species of sea turtle, so we'll have to drink water with our helmet open. After all, in the words of the great John Fortnite Kennedy, we are gamers, not because it is easy, but because we are hard. We start in a lander capsule, mere kilometers above the moon's surface. When the capsule pops open, we are greeted by the moon's surreal tranquility. Now it is time to disturb the ever-still regolith in order to make a super sweet base in space. But to build we must craft, and to craft we must mine. The first ore I find is oxide ice. Oxide is an icy mixture of mostly oxygen with just a bit of nitrogen, and that makes for an easy way to fill up our base with breathable air. Besides a stack of oxide, we'll need volatile ice for fire, lots of iron, some copper, and some silicon. And just a bit of gold for me lucky charms. Once we've got all the resources we need, we can return to the lander to get our space station up and running. By the lander is our lone starting crate. On a regular start, we'd have 5 or 6 crates, plus some spare gas tanks, so this is not a simple challenge. The first thing we'll need from our sad little yellow crate is 20 iron frames. Iron frames are the big airtight blocks that act as the ideal foundation for our base. Many different machines will need to be placed on top of iron or steel frames, so it's best to make as much of your floor out of them as possible. Before you start placing any frames, it is important to take note of the sun's path in the sky, so that you may orient your base to maximize solar production. On the moon, this is very easy. The sun will rise around 90 degrees on the compass, and it takes a path right up through the middle of the sky, with a daily eclipse behind the Earth. Once we've got the foundation aligned with the sun, we can run back for the crate to start welding it up. Frames can be welded twice, once for structural soundness and another time for air tightness. Since the moon's environment is so peacefully serene, we can build most of our machinery outside without any protection, just completely raw dogging the lunar surface. That means we'll only weld up most of these frames once. But we do need a habitat to eat, drink, and grow plants in, and that's going to have to be airtight. But we'll weld those later. We need to get crafting right away. For what was the mine, if not for the craft? First, the solar panel goes down, with a quick adjustment from a wrench to collect the sun's waning light. Then, we can throw our big suit battery in there so it can charge, and we'll just use this tiny one instead. Once our power network is in place, then we can start building an autolathe and an arc furnace and wire it all together. The arc furnace simply uses electricity to melt ores into ingots, which is almost a Minecraft reference, while the autolathe is our more than proverbial crafting table. Once all that is in place and we've smelted some iron and copper, then we can start crafting the basic furnace. Unlike the arc furnace, the basic furnace burns gaseous fuel. While the arc furnace can be useful even in the endgame for smelting iron and silicon, The gas furnace is more efficient for all the rest of the ores, and it's required to make alloys. After the furnace is done, we should start crafting the electronics printer. While the autolathe is great for producing structural components like frames, walls, doors, and lockers, the electronics printer does exactly what you think it does, probably. With it, we can now automate solar tracking and greatly increase the amount of power we can capture from the sun. Once the printer is done and we've smelted the rest of the ores with the gas furnace, we can produce the hydraulic pipe bender. This is another crafting device, and it will allow us to produce equipment to manage gases and liquids. You know, stuff like air and water. We'll also make some logic chips and a sensor to automate solar tracking with that electronics printer. Stay tuned to the end of the video for a brief lesson on the basics of logic chips. Once our hydraulic pipe bender is done, then we can work on the greenhouse. We'll put some windows up along the same axis as the solar panels to maximize our solar energy capture. This will not only help us heat the base, but it'll help us grow our beautiful potatoes. With a couple of doors, we have the beginnings of an airlock. All we need now is a vent to return air to our base anytime we want to leave. And with the sun rising, it's a perfect time to throw down our oxide so it can melt and pressurize the greenhouse. Besides using the sun to heat our ice, we need the sun to mine. While in Minecraft, we do not mine at night out of respect for the musical genius of Bebop Vox. We do not mine at night in Stationeers because it is hard to see. We'll need a lot more of the same ores for the second night, but we'll also need a large amount of steel. I did happen to find some lead right off the bat, which is super handy because we can use the leftover cool gas that's still in the furnace to make solder, which requires a very low temperature for its creation. We don't need that solder right this minute, but it will be handy eventually. With the sun setting, it's time to return to our space station to smelt some alloys. Currently, there's a lot of cold gas left over in the furnace. To get rid of it, we'll need a way to vent gas from the output of the furnace. With a couple of pipes, a cowl, and a valve, we can build a chimney for the furnace. While that cold gas slowly empties out of the furnace, I notice that our air tank is getting very close to empty. Luckily, our greenhouse is full of nice, breathable air. With an active vent as an intake and some pipe utilities to hold gas, we can now pressurize our air tank a couple of times over. However, our perfectly clean oxygen tank is now tainted with the foul scent of nitrogen. So we'll need to add a nitrogen filter to our suit in order to prevent it from accumulating in our helmet until we suffocate. But with that done, we can finally smelt the rest of our ore. Steel goes in first since it needs the highest temperature. Iron goes in next, followed by either copper or gold. Currently, our big suit battery gets filled less than halfway through the day, so the first thing we're going to need with all that steel is to upgrade our power systems. For that, we can make a stationary battery, which will take a few days to charge, even with a couple extra solar panels. But first, let's actually make those extra solar panels. At 500 watts each, tracking the sun all day, we're going to be making much more power than we really need at this point. Especially if you're the sort of OCD gremlin like me who needs to turn everything off as soon as I'm done with it. Finally, with the big battery in place, we can spend the rest of the day mining. That fancy air tank filler we set up earlier used up all the oxygen in the greenhouse, so the first thing we'll do for day 3 is mine some oxide. Besides all that, I want to make the rest of the intermediate alloys. Mining is tedious, and it sucks having to wait for the sunrise to mine. With sensor lenses, we can see all the ores right beneath our feet. The two difficult ones we need right away are Constantan and Invar. Both of these alloys require very high pressures, about 20 megapascals each. Given how much ice that requires, we want to make the biggest batch reasonably possible at one time. To that end, I'm going to wait until after I mine more ore tomorrow to smelt everything. Meanwhile, before we repressurize the greenhouse, we can set up a growing area for potatoes. All we need is an ice crusher to melt some water and some hydroponics trays to plant our potatoes in. Because of the way we align the windows, the sun will grow our potatoes without the need for a grow light. As much as it is less efficient to mine at night, it is even less efficient to do nothing, and with the greenhouse done, there's nothing else to do. Water ice is a handy find, of course, and another stack and a half of nickel is going to go towards that Invar and Constantan. I return to the base twice throughout the day to unload ore. With the sun finally setting on another day, it's time for some serious smelting. It's best to make Constantan first, then Invar, then steel, and then any other basic ores we have. And finally, after venting a lot of gas, we can make electrum. With the solder we made earlier, we now have access to all of the intermediate alloys. Of course, these alloys are useful for crafting a myriad of different machines, but our current priority is still sensor lenses. But in order to craft those sensor lenses, we need the super alloy Inconel. Super alloys require the advanced furnace to make, and the advanced furnace requires a Mark II electronics printer, while the sensor lenses themselves need a Mark II tool printer. So we've got a lot of upgrades we need to put in place, and we'll need some more space to fit everything. Once everything has been crafted, we need some more gold, nickel, and steel to make Inconel, so we'll have to do some more mining. Returning to base, we can finish what we started. The advanced furnace is a direct upgrade to the regular furnace, so we'll just scrap it and reuse the chimney parts. Now we load the furnace and bam, Inconel. With that, mining is much easier and much more precise. To complement this milestone, we can make a heavy mining drill to mine faster as well. Besides that, our potatoes are growing, we have plenty of air, and more than enough power to run all of our current machinery continuously. This is the inflection point where the game becomes more about careful planning than desperate panic. The last immediate problem we have to address on the moon is cooling the greenhouse. All that solar radiation that's growing our potatoes is also raising the temperature of our greenhouse by roughly 4 degrees Celsius every day, so our potatoes will be overheated within a week. The simplest type of cooler we can make on the moon is a vent-driven radiator. The radiators shed infrared light into the vacuum of space, radiating heat out of whatever gas it's interacting with. But this can easily go too far and freeze our potatoes. In fact, it can get so cold on the moon that nitrogen condenses as a liquid and carbon dioxide solidifies. Liquids, and especially ices that form in a pipe network, will destroy it, so we need some way to prevent our gas from supercooling. A simple one-way valve at the output of our radiator manifold will keep only a tiny amount of the same gas sealed away. Ices and liquids both need a minimum pressure to form, so this will solve the problem and ensure that our base is only being cooled while the intake vent is running. At this point, the game opens up and we have a lot of options for our next project. I went with a super basic system for melting and storing ices. And with all of our pipe networks painted and pretty, it's starting to feel just a little bit like home. It's almost the end of the video, so maybe you want to learn how those logic chip things work, so you can make your solar panels track the sun or automate your cooling system. All the devices in Stationeers have data called logic types. Many of them are obvious. For instance, most machines have a logic type called on, which is set to 1 when the machine is on and 0 when it's off. All logic types are expressed as numbers. Logic reader chips can read these values, while logic writer chips can write those values to machines. For our solar tracking, we hooked up a logic reader to a daylight sensor. The daylight sensor has a logic type called vertical that gives the current vertical position of the sun relative to the surface of the daylight sensor. When oriented exactly correctly, we can use the vertical value from the sensor and write it to the solar panel without any changes. Otherwise, we might have to use some logic math units to adjust the number. However, we want to control all of our solar panels at once. For this, we need a batch writer chip. The batch writer chip will write a value of a logic type to a whole batch of the same type of device. The logic system for our radiative cooling requires a couple more chips. Just like before, we need a logic reader to get a value from a device. In this case, we want the temperature of our base. To get that, we can read the temperature logic type from a gas sensor inside the greenhouse. Based on that temperature, we either want to set the intake on or off, or 1 or 0. To compare numbers, we use the logic compare unit. With a logic memory, we can set the value that we want to compare the current temperature to. In this case, we want the cooler to be on when the temperature is above 295 Kelvin, or about 23 degrees Celsius. If we use the greater operation on the logic compare chip, then the compare chip will output a 1 if the temperature is too high. Finally, we can take whatever the compare chip has decided and write that to the value of the intake vent using a logic writer chip. Logic systems can be significantly more complicated, but I hope those two basic examples serve as a decent introduction. More complex systems are better engineered with code anyway, and I'll discuss that in another video. Regardless, our moon base is in a safe and stable place, so we'll leave it at that. Tune in next time to see how to survive on Mars, the first planet we encounter with a sparse yet eternally present atmosphere, providing opportunities and dangers alike.